Welcome all to Lesson 3. We're going to talk about in two parts in this lesson, both the social impact of industrialization and the environmental impact of industrialization. And we'll look at it largely through an American lens, so largely through American history. Now, the United States emerged as an industrial power as part of this second industrial revolution, as we talked about briefly in a previous lesson. And some of the quote unquote captains of industry associated with this time period, the late 1800s, early 1900s, are depicted here. The Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Carnegies, and J.P. Morgans of the world. Historians haven't always been kind to the captains of industry, referring to them in a pejorative or negative sense as the robber barons, that these individuals with incredible wealth amassed that incredible wealth on the backs of individuals who really didn't have much. Therefore, you truly had a 1% that had quite a bit, and the vast majority of society didn't have much. More recent scholarship, however, is tended to look at these captains of industry in a little bit different light. They challenged the former interpretation of these captains of industries as being evil corporate leaders looking to take advantage of the weak and helpless out there, and rather began to look at these individuals as innovators, individuals that enabled other peoples in society to rise. Not only did the Carnegies provide an economic opportunity for individuals to work for them, not only did they help develop a middle class, but they also gave back to society as well. In the late 1880s, Andrew Carnegie wrote a really influential work titled The Gospel of Wealth. And in this work, he argues that individuals, wealthy individuals such as himself, had a moral obligation to give back to society. And by giving back, I mean being a philanthropist. That individuals such as him should help fund community projects like public libraries, like hospitals, like Habitat for Humanity and Meals on Wheels. This should be funded by individuals who had wealth and means such as him. Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth also had as sort of an underpinning theme here this idea that average everyday people's lives could be enhanced through the donations from individuals such as himself. Not everyday average people can write a check to the Philadelphia Orchestra. He certainly can. And that Philadelphia Orchestra then could show up in a park where average everyday people could show up and enjoy that. Their lives would be better for it. Those with less economic means, in need of support, could find some of that support in their funds. And if that support is coming from the wealthy folks, there's a less likelihood that the middle class is going to be taxed by the government to provide the social programs and so on and so forth for those that need the assistance. There was a selfish motive to some degree here in his message as well, which was basically this to his rich peers. Either we start to pony up, or we're going to invite some government bureaucrat to go ahead and tax us at some exorbitant amount, all right? Therefore, we should do it on our own and keep the bureaucrats out of our bank accounts, checkbooks, and tax returns. I'd be remiss if I failed to mention Milton Hershey as well, largely because of Hershey's proximity here to Williamsport. And wanted to briefly discuss Milton Hershey in this regard. He was a visionary and a pioneer because of his forethought. He recognized that he wanted to be able to give back as well. And so he came up with this innovative idea as it relates to his own estate or trust plan. Now, while time limits our ability to get into finer details here, I would ask that you guys, if you had some time, to look into Milton Hershey's story, especially as it relates to his wife, Kitty. They both loved children. They wanted to have children and couldn't have children. And when Kitty unfortunately passed away unexpectedly, it left Milton this sort of gap. And the way to fill that gap was for him to focus on perhaps developing a school. We might remember that school today as the Milton Hershey School. I mentioned that Milton Hershey got a little innovative as it relates to his own personal assets and the use of his estate planning and trust fund. So for the finance majors out there, Milton Hershey took the vast majority of his assets and placed them within the Milton Hershey School Trust Fund. He also named the Milton Hershey School Trust Fund owner of all of Hershey Entertainment. So Hershey Parks, any of the Hershey chocolates, you name it, it is all owned and run by the trust fund, which means individuals can't get in there and wreck it. They can't get in there and spend all the money away. That as long as the trust fund is viable, the school will be viable. So what does that mean for you and I today? As a small example of that, a fraction of a penny of every single piece of Hershey's chocolate that somebody consumes on a daily basis goes back into the trust fund to guarantee the life and longevity of the Milton Hershey School. Pretty dadgum innovative and really cool and impactful. Not to be outdone by the quote-unquote captains of industry, the average everyday Joe recognized that, hey, we can make a difference in our communities as well. I might not have $1,000,000, one person like Andrew Carnegie, but if there's 1,000,000 of us that can give $1, at the end of the day, you're still at 1,000,000 as far as donations go. And as a result of that, individuals, average everyday individuals, begin to subscribe to this thing called a social gospel, which for all intents and purposes was the common man's gospel of wealth. That average everyday people can give some money, or perhaps even more importantly, time. Perhaps not surprisingly, the lead as it relates to a voice to prescribe this social gospel came from the churches and religious communities. And again, this shouldn't be a surprise because anyone that studied American history recognizes that in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the majority of Americans attended church or worship service in some way, shape, or form. It far outpaced that of American society in the present age. History books have rightly given much print or prose to the name Washington Gladden from the time period. He was a leading voice, not just from the pulpit, but to also prescribe this social gospel. One such name that does often escape print, for some reason, I don't know, is that of Charles Monroe Sheldon, the Dr. Phil looking dude pictured here. Joking aside, he wrote a really influential work in the 1890s himself, titled here, In His Steps, What Would Jesus Do? So you get that WWJD finds its origination here in the late 1890s, and we associate that with Charles Monroe Sheldon. While I won't go into the actual thesis or story itself, you guys can Google that as it relates to In His Steps, What Would Jesus Do? I can make mention here that in all reality, this was very Harry Potter-esque for its day. It sold that many millions of copies. It really did. And it was passed about many towns from hand to hand. So that this social gospel in many ways was something people didn't just read, they were actually something that they could act upon themselves. And again, for many average everyday individuals, they didn't have extra money, but they certainly had time. And they gave time and attention to those in need as well. Much of the focus as it related to the gospel of wealth and social gospel actually happened to occur within the cities themselves. During the Second Industrial Revolution, there were many, many folks that left rural communities. They left their farms to move to factories in the city. And while it did create some economic opportunity, it also presented various challenges as well. At the same time individuals were leaving their farms and heading to the city, you have immigrants pouring in from all points of the compass, largely from Europe. And these individuals, as they're being processed in through places like Ellis Island, are looking for work. They too happen to be focusing then in urban areas. And as more and more people came for fewer and fewer jobs, it provided the opportunity for business leaders to go ahead and undercut wages. Anytime you have a supply of labor, wages can come down because somebody's always going to be willing to do work for less money per hour or per day than the market might dictate. In efforts to address the various challenges associated with urbanization, it wasn't just a guy's game. It was also a ladies' game. Now, while the ladies didn't have access to the ballot box yet, that'll come later, women such as Lady Jane Addams, depicted here, did take a leadership role and were immensely impactful in many ways. Akin to Charles Monroe Sheldon's In His Steps, I'm not going to go into detail here as it relates to Lady Jane Addams or her settlement house movement and the impact she had there. I'd ask that you guys Google that, and I would, because what she did there to help immigrant populations, to help reduce the friction between various ethnic groups and cities, say the Irish from the Italians from the Jewish, so on and so forth. It really did lessen much friction in urban areas in that regard, and did help people that were coming from abroad assimilate faster, learn the language faster, be able to negotiate contracts for themselves better, so on and so forth. I would ask that you guys take a peek at that. But one key point I want to make as it relates to Lady Jane Addams here is that her leadership efforts did help this larger narrative that ladies ought to have access to the ballot box as well. If we run households, if we can balance a checkbook, if we can run the kids to soccer, if we can have 15 plates in the air at the same time and not drop any of them, why is it we don't have a political voice? And Jane Addams, through her administrative leadership in organizations such as those she created here, via the Settlement House movement, she did help to strengthen that narrative and give voice to that narrative, which ultimately would result in ladies' access to the ballot box. While I'd like to be able to continue on here, I think we've covered enough ground, and I'm hoping to have at least whetted your appetite enough that maybe you'll go in and do a little bit more reading, do a Google search as it relates to this so-styled Gilded Age, or some peoples associated with that age, the Carnegies, the Charles Monroe Sheldons, the Lady Jane Addams of the age itself. Before we go, though, and move next into the environmental impact of industrialization, I want you to consider this final slide here, especially the question posed, the second question most especially. Given this trend, how might technology show the genius or folly of this trend? Are people still moving to cities today? And if so or not, how might technology be impacting that move into or away from? We'll discuss this more in Lesson 4 ahead. Dr. JC out. Lesson 3, Part 1. We'll move to the impact of industrialization on the environment next.